Okay, so now we're going to talk about how humans can impact populations. Okay, so the first thing you need to understand is what natural population growth looks like. So if you were to graph the number of organisms in an area, you're going to see an S-shaped curve. Okay, the number of organisms is going to slowly rise, and then you'll get kind of a steady incline, and then it'll level off. Okay, so you can see kind of the S-shaped curve. This is also known as logistic growth. So where it levels off here, that is your carrying capacity. Okay, so that's your maximum number that environment can support. And so this is a natural organism that is going to be native to an area. So a new population is going to grow very slowly at first and then more quickly because they will have unlimited resources. And when it levels off at the top of that S, that is carrying capacity, which I was just showing you. Remember, carrying capacity is the largest number of organisms the environment can support. And we talked about that with, remember Thomas Malthus in evolution. We talked about carrying, he's the guy who came up with carrying capacity and limiting factors. And so that was in the last unit on evolution. So your limiting factors are typically going to be food, water, habitat. Remember, that's the organism's home. Sometimes it's space for plants, and it might even be finding mates. But anyway, as long as the births and deaths are about the same and the immigration and emigration is about the same, organisms can live at carrying capacity. And anything above that is overproduced above carrying capacity will die out for some reason. Anyway, so most of the time they don't just live at carrying capacity because you do have limiting factors that we just discussed. So population density, that is the number of individuals living in that particular area at one time. So Van Cleve has a population density of however many thousand, maybe like, I don't know, 8,000 or something like that. I'm not sure, don't quote me on that. But anyway, so you have two types of limiting factors. So you know what a limiting factor is. We talked about it in the last 2 units. But there's 2 different types. So you need to know both types. You have density dependent and density independent. Okay. So density dependent, what it depends on is the number of organisms. Okay. So that's going to be the main ones we've talked about: food, water, habitat, shelter, space, things like that. But then you have density independent factors. These are things that do not depend on the number of organisms in that area. Okay, and that is things like a natural disaster or a human activity. Okay, so a density independent factor would be like if all of a sudden, I'm a deer and I'm just chilling, living my life, living in the woods, and all of a sudden these humans come up and clear the woods. Okay, that's a human activity that is going to change very drastically, very quickly. That's going to change the carrying capacity of many types of organisms in that area. Same thing with a natural disaster, like the fires in Australia earlier this year. Population dispersion. We've talked about dispersing before. So dispersion is like, if I disperse papers, I'm spreading them out from one stack to my whole class. So population dispersion is how individuals are spread out in an area. So, for example, in Van Cleve, we are spread out differently than the population is spread out in Ocean Springs. Ocean Springs are going to live much closer together compared to Van Cleve. So you have a couple of different types. You have clumped dispersion. So this is where people or organisms, doesn't necessarily have to be people, they live in groups where large numbers help for safety, for finding food, for mating. Okay, think like a beehive. They live kind of all clumped up in one area. Then you have uniform dispersion, where they're evenly spaced apart to decrease competition. If you're talking about plants, a lot of the times you see uniform dispersion because plants do, compete for space and sunlight and water, especially trees. And then you have random dispersion, where it's just randomly spread out because they don't depend on other organisms and they don't really have to worry about competing. So really you can observe all these types of dispersions in humans. Humans do clump up into cities, but we also can live in uniform dispersion or random dispersion, and that goes to lots of different animals too. So here is some pictures of what we just talked about, and this main picture here is going to be showing you carrying capacity. Okay, so here would be the carrying capacity, and notice how all these are reasons they die. They die from starvation, disease, parasites, accidents, hunting, predators, and weather. Okay, so everything above that is going to be how they die. Everything below that is going to be the survivors. Sorry, but anyway. So then you have unrestricted population growth. So we looked at normal natural population growth, which is going to be native species that are natural to that area. But you will get unrestricted population growth when you have a non-native, also called an exotic species, coming into an area. So anyway, an exotic species is going to be a species that is not native to that area, and it's introduced into an ecosystem that is not natural in. And because of that, it has it might have a natural predator, but usually these do not have a natural predator. So they have nothing to keep the population in check. They will also have plenty of food. So what this causes is exponential growth. So I showed you the graph, what logistic growth looked like for a native population. Now we're going to see the graph for a exponential growth, which is going to be a J-shaped curve. And you're going to see on that graph how the population just literally never stops growing, never reaches carrying capacity. A big example of this is these rabbits in Australia. So in the 1800s, 24 rabbits, that's 24 little rabbits. And people think, oh, rabbits aren't very harmful. Well, they can be. So these rabbits were introduced into Australia in the 1800s. They had no natural predators. And, Australia is a place with lots of natural predators. They say that it's one of the most dangerous, places to be in the wild because of all the predators. But anyway, these rabbits, they didn't have any natural predators. They had unlimited food. They're herbivores, so they just ate everything. And they very quickly overpopulated. We know that rabbits multiply very quickly. So they multiplied and multiplied and multiplied, and 200 years later, now hunters can shoot 1,200 rabbits a day, and it would not even make a dent in the population. So what this has caused over the past 200 years is wiping out a large amount of the plant population, which then wiped out a lot of herbivores, which then wiped out a lot of the things that ate herbivores. Ultimately, it caused the extinction of 1/8 of the mammals in Australia. 1/8 of the mammals, because 24 rabbits were introduced. So here is the rabbit. Bad rabbit. And then here's your J-shaped curve. Notice you never reach carrying capacity. It never levels off. Okay, so that's what exponential growth would look like. And hopefully y'all learned that in math before, but if you haven't, that's what it looked like. So technology. We love technology. Everybody loves technology, and it has been great, but there have been some negative effects of technology. Like with anything else, I think we all can recognize all the positives of technology. It's allowed rapid population growth. The life expectancy has went from like 40s to like 80s now, over the past couple hundred years. So technology has also allowed us to not have to hunt and gather. And then we were hunters and gatherers, then we were farmers. And then now we just go to the grocery store to get what we need. So, and that's the effect of technology. So it's great in many ways, but there have been some problems. So one thing that it's caused is an increase in competition for space, food, and water. And we're talking about competition between species, so humans versus pretty much everything else. And I think we know that humans dominate. Anyway, This disrupts how nutrients are recycled. The carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, all those cycles, the biogeochemical cycles we just talked about. So what happened was we were hunters and gatherers, so we just went out in the woods and found what we needed. Then we became farmers. And when we became farmers, we had to clear large plots of land. And then we needed people to live closer to each other so they could like trade with each other. And so what ended up happening was you'd clear all this big spot of land and you'd only farm like one thing there, like corn. And where before you would have lots of things growing in that area. So technology allowed us to form irrigation systems, but technology also allowed chemical fertilizers to be made and pesticides, bug spray. And so what happens is when it rains, those things run off into the water supply. So first we're going to talk about how fertilizers have a negative effect, and that is usually going to be algal bloom. So when it rains, the fertilizer runs off into the water supply. Algae typically lives in water. It's a plant-like protist, if you remember, so it goes through photosynthesis. But the fertilizer is going to have a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. And the algae are going to feed off of that. And so you'll have all this algae. Well, the algae doesn't live forever. And when the algae dies off, decomposers decompose the algae. So it's not the algae itself that causes the problem. It's the decomposition that causes the problem. So you'll have these microscopic decomposers that decompose the algae. Well, decomposers use oxygen the same way that fish do. They're both consumers. They both go through cellular respiration. So the decomposers are going to use up all the oxygen in the water. And so any kind of animal that lives in the water that uses oxygen, like fish, are going to suffocate. They're going to die. So one example of an algal bloom is a red tide. If you've ever watched the news, or it happens a lot in Florida, where they get a red tide, and it's because you have a lot of lakes and rivers and things in Florida, and lots of farming also, and then it runs off, and then you have this big red tide. Red tide is a red algal bloom, and the red algae just is a little more detrimental usually than the green algae. So that's why the news makes a big deal about it if it happens in that particular area. So here's a picture of a green algal bloom and then a red algal bloom, a red tide. So I told you both pesticides and fertilizer cause problems. Well, here's the problem with pesticides. So pesticides are going to be like bug spray. And if I'm a farmer and I'm growing crops, I don't want bugs eating all my crops before I can harvest them. And so we started using bug spray to kill the bugs. So what happens is, and if you recall when we talked about genetics, is that you'd put this pesticide on there, but eventually you would have a pest, whatever bug it is you're trying to get rid of, that would be resistant to that pesticide. And so that one resistant one would survive, and then it would reproduce, and now all of them are resistant because the non-resistant ones died, and so now all I have left is resistant ones, and survival of the fittest, those resistant ones will reproduce and pass on resistant genes. So that's just bringing back in genetics and evolution into this. So what happens is you have to keep using a stronger and stronger and stronger bug spray. Well, over time, they developed something called DDT. And so DDT is a very strong pesticide. And this has been, I want to say in the 70s, I think is when that came out. But anyway, so they didn't know at the time. They just thought, oh, it's a great bug killer. They didn't know that DDT builds up inside tissues in the food chain. So this is called biomagnification or biological magnification. Okay, so what happens is if you have a food chain, and so this is how eagles almost became extinct, is because of bug spray, because of biomagnification. So if you have a food chain and you have your plant, your producer, plankton maybe, and then a small fish eats the plant. This is what this paragraph you see is explaining. Okay, I'm just drawing you a picture. And then, so the big fish eats the small fish, and then the eagle's going to come along and eat the big fish. Okay, so there's like a sample food chain. Oh, they put a bird in there too. Well, fish will eat birds. I'm sorry, eagles will eat birds, or but we'll put it in there just to make it match. So anyway, here's your plant. Okay, it had bug spray on it, or it ran off into the water supply, and then it got into the fish. Okay, so this small fish eating the plant does not eat one plant its whole life. Okay, it eats a plant every day, maybe multiple plants every day. So let's say it eats 20 plants a day. Okay, so now that small fish has 20 plants worth of pesticide in its body. Okay, well then the big fish comes along and eats the small fish. Okay, well this big fish does not eat one small fish its whole entire life. It's going to eat a small fish every single day. Okay, so maybe it's ate 2,000 small fish in its lifetime. Okay, so it's going to have 2,000 bits of DDT in it. Okay, so it's magnifying as we go. So then the bird eats the big fish. Well, that big fish ate 2,000 in its lifetime. Well, the bird's not going to eat just one big fish. Again, it's going to eat a whole bunch too. So you're going to end up multiplying. So it would be like 20 times the 2,000 and times how many fish is the bird going to eat. Let's say maybe the bird only ate 500. You're still going to multiply that. You're not going to have to do this math. It's just for you to understand. And then that eagle is going to eat a whole bunch of birds in its lifetime. The eagle's a top predator. It's probably got a longer lifetime. So it's going to have, let's say maybe, 10,000 birds. So if you multiplied all this, you get a really big number. And that would be how much DDT would be built up in the eagle's body over time. Okay, so it builds up. Each level in the food chain gets more and more and is more magnified. It gets more and more and more DDT in its body. Remember, this magnification, we usually are going to multiply like we did magnification for the microscope. Anyway, you're not going to have to do any kind of math with this. You just need to understand what it is. It's multiplying it as you go through the food chain. So how this almost killed out the bald eagle. So it didn't hurt the actual eagle. What happened was when the eagle laid its eggs and the mama bird would sit on the egg, the shells would crack. The shells were very, very fragile. And so the only reason they did not become extinct is because humans intervened and they would take the eggs out of the nest. Of course, this is under research lab kind of places, and they take the eggs out of the nest and then they put them in incubators rather than the mama bird sitting on them like is what would happen in the wild. So, fortunately, with human intervention, the eagles are, they might still be in danger, but I don't think they are anymore. I think they're just considered, what's the other word? Like at risk or something like that. But we have bald eagles around here. If you've ever been around Lake of Pines, Spring Lake area, I've seen some there before. So the population is coming back thanks to human intervention. So humans can cause problems, but we also try to fix things too. So here are some pictures of the bald eagle. Look at that. I would not want those talons grabbing hold of me. Poor little fish. Okay, so the use of natural resources. So Industrial Revolution, I mentioned that before, that's when we started using machines. Machines were powered using oil and gas and coal and things like that. Well, those things are non-renewable resources, and non-renewable resources take millions of years to form. Then you have renewable resources. They can be renewed relatively fast. So that's going to be like trees, and fresh water. Now, it's important to note that even though the resource is renewable, they are not available in renewable amounts. Okay, so what that means is we are using up fresh water and trees much faster than they can be renewed. It takes years and years and years for trees to grow to maturity, but we're cutting them down too fast of a rate for the trees to catch up with the growth. A lot of our fresh water supply also is contaminated. And I mean, in the U.S., we're a country that has a lot of regulations on things like that. Think about some of these other countries that don't have regulations. So, if you ever watch TV, they'll come on with commercials about these like kind of third world countries not having clean drinking water. It's a big deal to have clean drinking water. And we don't so much have to worry about that. And of course, we have a Walmart on every corner, so they don't. Anyway, what it boils down to is that because renewable resources are not available, it takes a long time for the resource to renew, but not as long as non-renewable. We still have to conserve both. They're both in limited supply, both renewable and non-renewable, so we have to conserve both. So one of the problems burning fossil fuels causes is acid rain, acid precipitation. Acid precipitation damages plants, but it also might damage the water supply or other resources. So here, this is showing natural gas, like a stove burner if you have a gas stove. And then this is showing some effects of acid rain. Okay, so as you can see, it's damaged this plant. And that plant's going to have a hard time recuperating. And then it's damaged a statue. If it can do that to a statue, imagine what it could do to a living organism. Land pollution, or more commonly known as trash, is also very common. A lot of things we put in the trash take a very long time to decompose. So just as a health conscious, or not necessarily health conscious, environmentally conscious human, you should choose natural products. So for example, we use paper plates in my house, not all the time, but a lot of the time we do. And I don't buy the styrofoam plates. I buy the ones that are paper plates because paper is made from trees. Trees are living at one point, and so they biodegrade faster. The styrofoam ones are cheaper, but styrofoam takes a very long time to decompose. So even though the little styrofoam plates are going to be cheaper, the paper ones are going to be much better for the environment. And so Mr. Bell's sitting over there thinking to himself, oh, Miss Bell's been buying the more expensive ones, but I'm trying to be environmentally conscious over here, but I ain't trying to do the dishes all the time either. Anyway, so another thing is, I mean, when you run the dishwasher, you're using water too. So, I mean, either way, you know, are going to use some resources. Anything that is natural means it comes from a living thing. Living things are easily broken down by microorganisms. So, banana was living at one point. You peeled the banana peel is going to be easily broken down. Paper towels, paper plates, those things, paper, it came from a tree. Cotton clothing over polyester, they're going to biodegrade faster because microorganisms are going to be, they're used to breaking down natural things. So they'll be returned back to the soil faster in a landfill than would a man-made product. Man-made products are going to be rubber, plastic, chemicals. Metals, although metals are not necessarily man-made, metals are not typically organic, so they are not going to be broken down easily by microorganisms. So they're going to take hundreds of years. Glass, they're going to take a very long time to decompose. So this is a really cool slide. A lot of people love this. So if you look, this shows the average, and it depends on different things, but this is the average rate of decomposition for some different common items. So if you look, a paper towel takes 2 to 4 weeks in nature to decompose. Same thing with like orange or banana peel. Newspaper is paper. It's kind of thin too, newspaper is. So it's going to take about 6 weeks. So going up, a cigarette filter, y'all better not be smoking, is going to take 1 to 5 years. This is why you see them everywhere. plastic bags, 10 to 20 years. That's why you've seen a movement towards people bringing their own grocery bags and having them refilled at the grocery store. Nylon, 30 to 40 years. A tin can, 50 years. Here you go with the styrofoam. A styrofoam cup, 50 years. Okay. Aluminum can. Okay, that's like a Coke can you drink out of. 80 to 200 years. One diaper, one disposable diaper, 450 years. Plastic beverage bottles. Now, I do want to say this. So, plastic beverage bottles, 450 years. But plastic is easily recyclable. And also, you might have noticed that they're making some beverage bottles thinner. I know that, like, if I was to have like a Barks root beer bottle, I can't just easily crush it in my hand. But then I have some other water bottles that you can just smash very easily. It's because they're making the plastic thinner because so that it can be easily recycled. And a lot of the times you'll see a lot of things will have on the side of it that it's made from recycled plastic. So, and then a glass bottle is 1 million years. That's why if you ever find like an old glass Coke bottle, it looks almost new and it might be 100 years old because it takes 1 million years for it to decompose. And glass is recyclable too. Now, one thing at the top of this list that is not really recycled is fishing line. Okay, so I know someone in my class right now that's thinking, oh man, because he likes to go fishing a lot and he knows who I'm talking about. But your fishing line takes 600 years to decompose. Now think about if you've ever been fishing or you've been with someone fishing and the hook's caught in their mouth and you just cut the line, or how many times the line would be, you might find fishing line in the water, the ocean or wherever. So in the oceans, there's lots of just fishing line. They'll find it, so not only do organisms get tied up in it, but it doesn't decompose very fast. So, and that's not something that's just recycled a lot. So plastic beverage bottles, even though they take a long time, they're recycled a lot. Can't really recycle a disposable diaper. Can't really recycle the fishing line. But some of these things you can and some you can't. So urban development, kind of touched on this earlier. So basically humans have taken over the world. Humans need places to live, so we remove homes from other things. We clear land for us to live. And when you clear land, you're decreasing the biodiversity of organisms in that area. So I mentioned earlier when we would clear land and only plant corn there, well, you did have hundreds of organisms living in that area. Now you only have one pretty much, and maybe a few others living in that area. So biodiversity, diversity, we've talked about a lot, is variety. And so biodiversity is the variety of life, because y'all know bio means life. So this is the variety of life in an area. More specifically, biodiversity is the number of species in an area. And it's not going to be a specific number, but if you have a higher number versus a lower number, a higher number of species will be a higher biodiversity, a lower number of species will be a lower biodiversity. So if I was to compare the biodiversity of my yard versus the woods behind my house, the biodiversity is going to be much larger in the woods behind my house compared to what's living in my actual yard. Fertilizers, chemicals that you put on your lawn and garden can cause problems. Weeds are actually native plants, and we kill weeds. Mr. Bell likes to kill the weeds. We kill the weeds because we want our pretty grass to grow. So weeds, native plants are often killed so that we can have a grassy lawn. Slugs, aphids, grasshoppers, different bugs are killed by pesticides. So those weed killer pesticides, weed killer is called herbicide, by the way. If you see that, that's referring to weed killer, like Roundup. Anyway, those seep into the groundwater, local water supplies. If you're just putting it at your house, you're not going to be putting enough of it in to affect the local water supply. But if you have thousands of acres that you are farming and you're using it on all of that, then that will definitely affect the local water supply, in which you would get like the algal bloom that we talked about. So anyway, in addition to that, you often have non-native exotic species introduced, and then they will compete with a native species. So a non-native species is always going to outcompete a native species, because the native species have predators. Non-native species don't. So a lot of the times this will, cause a native species to possibly even go extinct, because the non-native species will take over the niche or the role of the environment of that native species. What's actually happened a lot is that these exotic species or bought as pets, and then they don't want to deal with them anymore, so they just release them into the wild. So one thing, and I'll show you, here are some non-native species. Okay, so you're going to be familiar with all these probably. So this is a nutria rat. So nutria rats are very common in our area, but even more common in Louisiana. And so nutria rats were not native to America. I think they came from Asia, somewhere in Asia. Can't remember exactly. But anyway, they came over on, I think, boats, I want to say. Anyway, nutria rats are very destructive. We've had a den of them at our old house in the field, and they're really big. I mean, they get bigger than, I have an 9 pound dog, but I would say they get probably like 20 pounds. They're huge. They're nasty looking. Anyway, so nutria rats, if you've ever seen one of these are an exotic species, and they take over. I know at one point, if you've ever watched Duck Dynasty, the state of Louisiana will pay you $5 for every nutria rat tail that you bring in, because they're such a problem. Here in the bottom picture, you have a python. So pythons obviously are going to be an apex predator. Not really anything eats them. These pythons have been known to eat deer. Okay, they just eat everything. One of the problems with the pythons is that in Florida, they were in pet stores, and the pet stores flooded after a hurricane, and the pythons just went out into the wild. And then you have people who get them, and then they're little when they get them, but then they grow to be 12 feet and they're too much to handle, and then they release them into the wild. And these things can have lots and lots of eggs, and again, no natural predators. So pythons are a very big problem in the Florida Everglades. So this is one that they caught. And then this other, and there's different variety of pythons, but either way, they're not native. Or constrictors. It's like boa constrictors too. Both of those. They're not going to be native to that area. But anyway, this is what's called kudzu. If you've ever seen this before. Kudzu was a plant that was brought in, and they had good intentions. They wanted to control erosion with it. But it takes over. I used to work in Mobile, and I remember there was a stop sign, or like some kind of sign, and the kudzu would just grow up over the sign, and then like every couple weeks they would cut it back. So if you ever go in towards Mobile, you'll see a lot of this kudzu, and we have some around here in different places, but you see a lot of it in Mobile if you ever go that way. And so what the kudzu does is a plant, it's going to take over, and then you see that there's plants underneath it, but it's going to outcompete. It's taken up a lot of the space, a lot of the sunlight, a lot of the water. So we talked about ozone earlier, how it's made of O3, okay, and how we cannot use it. It's about 20 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, so it should be way up there. But if it's down here at the ground level, it's considered a pollutant. You cannot use it. Your body can only process O2. It cannot process O3. The ozone layer is very important because it's going to block out the sun's UV radiation. If you remember, the ultraviolet radiation is what I called ionizing, which can cause damage to your DNA. That can cause sunburn. It can damage your eyes. It can cause skin cancer. It can damage plants. Anyway, so ultraviolet light. This is why you should wear sunscreen or sunglasses that block the UV radiation. But fortunately, we have the ozone layer to protect us. Now, about 40 years ago, scientists noticed that there was a hole in the ozone in two places. One above Antarctica, the other above the Arctic. So kind of north-south pole in the cold areas. So, by 1995, the hole, spelled wrong, in the Arctic was so big that they noticed that you had higher levels of UV radiation in the United States. Now, we are a good ways away from the Arctic. Okay, so they noticed this in different places in the world. There's also certain places in the world who they had an increase in skin cancers, particularly places that are closer to where the ozone holes are. But anyway, the reason why they figured out that the reason why you had these holes in the ozone is because of something called CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. So chlorofluorocarbons used to be used as a propellant in any aerosols. So think like hairspray, spray paint. It was also used in air conditioners, freezers, refrigerators for like the cooling mechanism, and then in certain types of plastic foam products. And so those CFC molecules pulled apart the O3s. Okay, so they pulled apart the 3 molecules of oxygen, and so that pulled apart the ozone layer. So it slowly broke down the ozone layer. And then by the time humans figured out that we had holes in the ozone layer, and then they had to figure out what was causing it. So we were using these CFCs for all this time. Anyway, they've been pretty much phased out. There's only certain things that you could still find CFCs in. And even then, you have to, this is why you can't just throw a refrigerator out. It's supposed to be disposed of a certain way. But anyway, the problem is that those CFCs that are in the atmosphere, they're going to stay there for a couple hundred years. But because we phased them out and we've stopped using them, scientists do expect that the ozone layer will stop getting worse and will start getting better by mid-21st century. So that's, 2050. So maybe about 30 more years they think it'll start getting better and recuperating. And it is one of those things that can fix itself over time. So this is just a picture showing you the ozone layer. So it's going to be way up high, 20 kilometers. Okay, so that's higher than the peak of Mount Everest. If you see, that's higher than airplanes travel. Okay, and then you do have damaging industrial ozone because it's down here at the ground level. That's why I said it's a pollutant at ground level. And this is what a CFC molecule looks like. So here's the chlorofluorocarbon. So you have your carbon, and then your fluorine, and then what is the chloro? Chloride, I guess, chlorine. Global warming. So global warming happens for a couple of reasons. Some people believe that the thinning ozone has contributed to the warming of the earth because it's allowing more UV radiation in. But the big thing that they've contributed to global warming is the burning of fossil fuels and simultaneously cutting down trees. So the big words for that is burning fossil fuels would be combustion, and then cutting down trees, deforestation. which we know deforestation also causes habitat destruction. So, one thing I want to say about this is that scientists know that there are natural temperature cycles in the Earth. I think we've talked about before that there have been multiple ice ages throughout time, and burning of fossil fuels has only been, the past couple hundred years. So, scientists do know that the Earth heats and cools different cycles, but they're worried that the temperature is increasing faster than it normally would or faster than it should be. So, carbon dioxide concentrations have increased because of combustion and deforestation. Burning the fossil fuels increases the carbon dioxide, and we're cutting down the trees that normally would be taking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So you have way more carbon dioxide than you should in the atmosphere. And so that messes with the carbon cycle. Scientists say that even a change in 1 to 2 degrees Celsius can make the polar ice caps melt. If the polar ice caps melt, then the ocean levels will rise. That will cause flooding in coastal areas, but it can also cause severe droughts in other areas. If you've ever looked at population centers, populations are heavily around the coastal areas because before you had airplanes, a lot of people traveled long distances with ships. So, anyway, because of if the polar ice caps and all melt, then that will speed up the water cycle. So anyway, another thing burning fossil fuels does is it not only increases carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but it also increases nitrogen oxide. And that will also destroy the ozone. It creates smog, acid rain, and nitrogen oxide actually heats up the atmosphere more than carbon dioxide does. And so this is just some pictures of some things that contribute to global warming. I don't know if y'all know who this is. This is Al Gore. He was President Bill Clinton's vice president. And he was big into global warming. Made a movie about it. Sustainable use. So, basically, as humans, to try to be helpful for our environment, we need to use less resources on Earth. We need to try not to damage the biosphere, and we need to try to conserve what we can. So little things like turning off the water while you brush your teeth is going to help by using less renewable resources. And also like carpooling, Mr. Bell and I, we ride together to work. So we're using less gas, less oil in our vehicle. So we're using less non-renewable resources. Protecting endangered species and reintroducing species into areas where they once lived. And then reusing and recycling when we can. And just being aware of everyday things that could possibly help be environmentally conscious. Okay, so just some cute little pictures. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is biomes. So look out for the next video for that.